Anyway, Sony Kapoor, thank you for coming to Det Moderne India and our podcast. We have 20 minutes for a conversation, I would call it, partly about you, but mainly about the world, about Norway, and about the country of your birth, India. That's correct, right?
Yes.
You're Indian.
Well, yes, in a manner of speaking, though India no longer accepts me as one of their own. India doesn't allow dual citizenships, so I'm sadly only British. And in a post-Brexit world, it's not a very nice place to be.
I can see that point. However, you have decided to reside in Norway. Why is that?
Whew. Okay, I have I think the fairest way of talking about it would be to say I have a sort of love-hate relationship with the Nordics in general and with Norway in particular. And let's say that I'm in sort of the loving phase right now, having the relationship having gone up and down. And the backstory is that when I was growing up in India, so I come from a very progressive family of intellectuals and socially active people. My father was a senior bureaucrat, my mum was a teacher, and they in turn were both refugees. My father's family were landed gentry in Pakistan who had to leave everything behind, come to India at the time of the partition in 1947.
Right.
And my mum's family were industrialists in what is present-day Burma, Myanmar.
Oh.
And they had to leave everything, come in 1948. So, they were very socially aware of how important circumstances are. So even at school, and I remember this fairly distinctly, I was a big admirer of the Nordic model of fairness, of equality, of opportunity, of a flat, non-hierarchical society, particularly, in a country where the circumstances of your birth, up till recently, and even now in many rural areas, basically, define your life trajectory. Exactly. So the complete opposite of the worst parts about India. And of course, as you would know, having been a Norwegian diplomat and having projected Norway's positive image outside, that the perception, the idealized perception of the Nordic model that is projected abroad and that is understood and amplified is different from the reality, which is, let's say, a little more gritty, a little less rosy, and comes with a number of downsides. And so since I started coming to the Nordics 20 odd years back, I think the first time I was in Norway was in 2000 to 2001. It's been a slow process of discovery and of, that idealized image coming into contact with the reality that is not really as nice or rosy or fair or meritocratic as is projected. And that's, I think, explains my love-hate relationship. So, there are many wonderful things about the Nordics, including Norway, and there are some god-awful things. And I started coming to the Nordics knowing only about the wonderful things. And it's the slow discovery of the god-awful things that makes it, complicated relationship. Right. So if this was a Facebook status update, I would say it's complicated.
Just like any marriage.
Truth? Not that I would know.
Anyway, so thank you for that opening, presentation of yourself. However, being Indian and living in Norway, having a love-hate relationship with the Nordics, you're also very global. I mean, your background, Lehman Brothers, LSE, advisor to the European Commission, and so forth, that gives you sort of not only a bilateral background, but also a truly global context within which to understand the world, the social, economic reality of Norway and India. Now, building on your financial background, you were at Lehman Brothers before the collapse. When was that?
Oh, no, I left way before the collapse.
It was not your fault.
Nothing to do. No, not at all. Just so this part should not be edited out.
No. Yeah. However, I want to ask you something. I mean, one of my favorite movies from way back was the one where Gordon Gekko says, "Greed is good." Having lived 3 years in India, and for that matter being from Norway or for anywhere, And growing up during the 80s, or coming of age in the 80s, I do recall that with some admiration. I saw the movie and I thought, that guy's cool. Then, of course, I came to realize that maybe he wasn't that cool. Do you think he was cool to say that?
I think, what's interesting is, despite, in some ways, as I said, we come from sort of polar opposite backgrounds, right? I mean, I grew up in Delhi, a city of more than 10 million people, and you're from Svalbard up there, right?
Yeah.
But on these issues, I think we have very similar perceptions. So the India of the license Raj, the India of the 1970s and 80s of my upbringing, was not really a market economy, right? I mean, there was a very heavy degree of sort of socialist influence. Almost every single thing. There was bureaucratic overreach without there being bureaucratic capacity. And basically, so it was, including in my household, the perception was, if you had money as a businessman, you must be corrupt. Because frankly, there was no non-corrupt way of making money. And in any kind of business you're in, without having paid off corrupt officials and, inspectors or the tax authorities, etc., you'd basically, have your business driven into the ground, right? So that was the perception. So in terms of social hierarchy and the respect that you afford to others in, urban intelligentsia circles, a teacher, a doctor, a bureaucrat, an engineer, all of these professions had, even though they didn't have money, they had far more respect than anybody with money. Right. And those who had money, the businessmen with flashy houses and cars, etc., they had money, but they didn't have respect. And what was really shocking to me was how quickly that changed. So when India was forced to undergo these market reforms in 1991 after a currency crisis, within the next 10 odd years or so, I mean, it did unleash, the animal spirits. Right. And, Gordon Gekko's, greed is good. Yeah. When human beings are allowed opportunity to be better, to make more money, to do better for themselves, etc., there's a huge amount of entrepreneurial talent, right? And a lot of that was unleashed, which was kept in check. But it came about with the downside that, for example, when I went to visit my school again, and when I went to my university, I went to the Indian Institute of Technology, the elite engineering school, etc. It was a very different culture, to the point where I think within 10 to maximum 20 years, if you had money, you had respect. And anybody without money, no matter what your social contribution, no matter whether you were a doctor or a teacher, they lost respect in society. And it became a very different society. So the India of today is very different from the India that I grew up in ways both good and bad. So the question, going back to what you said, was, greed is good, because that is a fundamental driver of, you can call it greed, you can call it aspiration, you can call it unleashing animal spirits. It comes with very different names, but within constraints, within boundaries, because we are social creatures, we live in society, and that's what it's about. And as long as those are respected, it's an enormous power.
Very good point. And you mentioned society. The first sentence of my dissertation at the LSE, where we both went, right?
Yeah.
Was a quote from Margaret Thatcher. There is no such thing as society. What do you think of that?
Well, I vehemently disagreed with that, I think already about 20 years ago. But before that, I must confess, there can be such a thing. And I think, let's just bring this back to Norway again, right? There can be such a thing as too much society. Janteloven, for example, where social norms are so stifling that they stop the expression, they inhibit the expression of individuality and etc. Right? So my freedom ends where your nose begins is generally a good principle. But I think that, be it culturally or through regulation or in authoritarian society through, sheer force, any force that suppresses the natural entrepreneurial ability, talent, and desire of human beings to have a better tomorrow than yesterday, to try new things, to do things differently, etc. I think that eventually is, in an overarching sort of way, a suffocating place to be. And I think getting the balance right is all what it's about. So I do think there are many cases where there's too much of what we can call society. But I think we long ago tipped away from that into a place where there's far too little.
Thank you. And that brings me to the next level. We've been talking about India, we've been talking about Norway and the Nordics. Let's take the conversation up to the transnational, global level. Society, a social contract. That's basically what defined Norway post-Second World War. That was not unique to Norway, but was more common in Northwest Europe than most other countries to this day. Do you think at the global governance level, there is a recognition that we need to balance the rules and regulations or rebalance them towards a greater, I should say, sense of social responsibility across borders? And I'm not talking about the traditional debate about poor and rich countries, but to a greater extent with the interdependence and transnational character of the globalized economy, solidarity and social contracts among people across borders. And do you think the current global governance structure is able to do that?
Oh, well, let me start with the last part first. The current global governance structure is hardly able to, hold the barest of strings together just from stopping everything going into total disorder and chaos, right? I mean, so that is clearly, absolutely, totally inadequate. So the question is, whether, particularly with COVID, there's a new recognition about how threadbare the international governance structure is compared to the sheer scale and scope of interdependencies.
Exactly.
And I think within a number of circles, there's a clear recognition that is absolutely the case, right? But at the same time, we have arrived here after a decade or more of populism, of Brexit and Trump and all of that nonsense, having pushed the system really to its boundaries. So in some ways, right, the question is, are we at the rock bottom of the gap between the degree of interdependence and the governance structure appropriate to handle that independence, that from now on, things can only get better? Or is it that post-COVID, given, some initial responses of at least some countries, some of that populism, nationalism is going to continue and things will continue to get worse? And one can hope that COVID has shown the light. It has exposed many populists for what they are, which is charlatans. As the tide has gone out, everybody from Bolsonaro to Boris Johnson to Trump and many others, and to some extent, even Modi, have been shown to be people with let's say, words far, far bigger than their ability or intention to deliver. And people's trust in those with big words is going to fall, and there's going to be more sensible. And the biggest, clearest significance of this, if we thought what's happening with COVID is bad, what climate change is going to do to us is going to be an order, if not 2 orders of magnitude worse. Absolutely. And there, the degree of interdependence is even greater. At least with COVID, you can slam down the borders, right? You can try and manage. You can have lockdowns. You can keep the barbarians at the gate, etc. But nobody's going to keep carbon dioxide at the gate, right? And no matter how tall dikes the Dutch continue to build, trying to arrest a sea level rise of 3.5 meters, that may happen now with Greenland irreversibly having gone into melting and many Antarctic glaciers going. That's not going to be possible. So I think the best thing that might come out of COVID, to the extent something good can come out of it, is that it's a timely last chance reminder to humankind of what an interdependent physical, economic, social, cultural, independent world we live in. And if we don't get our, excuse my language, shit together now in terms of behaving as if there is that independence and having a social contract at a global level, then I think humanity has screwed up its chance.
I tend to agree. And now I'm going to digress a little bit and perhaps reveal my own political point of departure. You mentioned 4 names in the context of populism: Trump, Boris Johnson, Bolsonaro, and Modi. In terms of left-right political spectrum, what do they have in common? Aren't they all on the right side of the traditional left-right discussion?
They are, but I think what's been, if you look at, since we are in the business of offending people, let's add Obrador in Mexico, who's on the left side of the spectrum. And his performance in the COVID crisis has been really shoddy, right? I mean, both in terms of health outcomes, but also in terms of what's going to happen to the economy. Mexico is not expected to reach its present pre-COVID sort of income levels for many years to come. Sort of 4 or 5 years of lost growth.
Right. So let's leave the left-right conundrum and think what it takes to address the lack of understanding or interdependence. What kind of leadership would you like to see? What would be the rhetorical message that you would present as the unique selling point? What is it that it takes for the general public who are not globalists like you and me, but who live their lives locally, nationally, and that's perfectly fine. That's what normal and most people do around the world. But their sense of distance from themselves to the political decision makers nationally, but even more so at the global level, is striking. There is a disconnect between the high flyers who meet in DC and in Geneva and New York, and for that matter in Davos, where you are affiliated in the World Economic Forum. That distance and the perception of that distance is increasing rapidly. What can the leaders do to address that problem? Frankly, if I knew the answer, I would throw my hat into the ring of politics. It's something it's an idea I've flirted with a number of times, but I really don't have the answer to that, right? And in some way, one can say that President Macron tried that different approach. He was quite straight with the people. He said difficult things need to be done. He was still quite nationalistic in a way that French always are, right? In a charming way. But at least he had a pan-European and a sort of global outlook, and he didn't pitch it as a debate of us versus them, right? So it wasn't a divisive approach, and he won with a landslide. It's unclear if he will win a second term. In the Netherlands, D66 tried with some success to come in with open pan-European liberal global agenda. Right. So there've been I think an encouraging number of cases where new, fresh, non-divisive, non-populist approaches, refreshing approaches to politics have been tried. What's really good about the present time, which is also what's bad, is that the barriers to entry for a lot of things have fallen very, very sharply, right? And that includes barriers to entry for politics, for having any kind of public voice, and so it allows even like people like you and I, who otherwise may not have ever
considered because, we didn't become treasurers in the Labour Party when we were 20 to pursue a traditional political career, to have political influence and even, consider jumping into politics. And while I personally am probably not going to do that, at least not anytime in the near future, I think a number of my friends, for example, in the present Democrat election in the United States, a number of people, who worked in the Green Party in many countries in continental Europe, some people in D66, some people in Macron's party, etc. I mean, they're putting their hats in. So I think there's something good happening. And what's okay? So maybe let's put it slightly differently. I think what's been really remarkable with Greta and Fridays for the Future strikes, and with what's happening with sort of schools now and universities and the young, is the re-engagement of the youth in politics, right? Because if you look across the world, it's been generally true that the older electorate is far more likely to vote, far more engaged. And the youth, whether it's people with at 16 have the right to vote, or in other countries whether they have it at 18 or something, they've generally been quite disengaged.
Yes.
And so I think that COVID and what has happened to schools and universities now, together with what's been happening with Greta and her ilk and climate change, has really re-engaged and re-energized the youth. And that gives me a lot of hope.
All right. Thank you for that pitch, because that sort of reminded me of the second point that I have, a third point. That is the challenge of sustainable development being seen by most, rightly so, as a green transition. However, as you know, the sustainable development concept has three corners, as you may call it. The green corner of ecological sustainability, the blue corner of economic sustainability, and you might call it the red corner, pun not intended, but of social justice. So the perception among many, especially the older generation, is that the youth are somewhat naive to the consequence of the transition, costing jobs and livelihoods and traditional lifestyles for those 50 and above. How to bridge those two groups in a, sustainable and credible manner? How do you bring the three corners of sustainable development together as one?
Well, I think in the parts of the world which face the biggest challenges, potential trade-offs, etc. And there, India is, of course, a great example. The average age in India, if I'm not mistaken, is less than 30. Yeah. Right? So in some sense, that's a non-debate, because, you have the vast majority of the population of the younger demographic who are going to live with the consequences of climate change. Sure. And everything, and they have, if they start voting, overwhelming political power.
However, be careful, because the culture of contentment of the majority should not be let run over the minority. And in the case of Norway, and in Northwest Europe at least, and the United States to some extent, slightly less in the US, but at least in Northwest Europe, the demographics are different.
Yeah.
So the youth are seen to be challenging the way of life of the majority, who are my age or above, at least 40 and above.
Yeah.
And that's a political reality we have to address.
Yeah.
So back to my question. How can we bring together the green, blue, and red corners of sustainable development in a politically sustainable way? So you have legitimate decisions in all stratums and in age groups.
So this is an hour-long conversation at least, but I can give you brief, cheesy, one-liner answers,
I like that.
which provide some insight. So one is, going back to Greta, right? And I'm a recent father, and frankly, there are parts of the emotional spectrum that I simply did not know existed
before I became a father,
right?
I know the feeling.
And when people, and frankly, so every time before this, I heard politicians or business leaders talk about, our children and grandchildren. We must fight climate change because of our children and grandchildren, right? It used to just irritate me because I've been working on climate change for 20 years. Not because I thought I was going to have children, or because it was the right thing to do, right? For me, that was enough. You didn't need to be personally have a stake that, your grandchildren's house would be flooded, right? But I think that filial bond, the love people have for children and grandchildren, is the single most underexploited political force in the entire world. And Greta and her ilk have only just begun to galvanize that, right? I mean, whether you're running the oil fund or whether you are, the minister of oil in Norway, or whoever you are, and your child or your grandchild comes home after Friday's strike, looks you in the eye and says, "Stop screwing my future, Daddy. Stop burning, my life away, Mommy." You cannot but not help respond to that in an emotional way, right?
I follow you on that. However, to be a devil's advocate here, the question is for many, okay, we agree in principle what is the right thing to do on behalf of our grandchildren, but also on behalf of the world at large. However, the question is, who is going to pay the price of that adjustment and who's going to gain the benefits?
Right.
The question of justice, I think it's key to understand the reality of why there is such a stalemate.
Of course.
Because the perception is, many times for good reason, that I'm paying a heavy price and somebody else is taking all the benefits. And the yellow vests in what do you call it in French? I don't know what you call it. And to some extent also Brexit, and not to mention Trump.
Yeah.
The political reality is that a lot of people, for good reason, think that they are paying a heavy price, whereas somebody else is running off with the gains.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
So at a macro level, I think it's so just abstracting from the politics for a second, right? There is no trade-off. So Trump has spent the past 4 years trying to save coal jobs in the United States, and it hasn't worked, right? British Petroleum and Shell and everybody else has been fighting, trying to, Exxon in particular, trying to discredit climate change, trying to, have enormous lobbying power, and yet their business models are collapsing. Volkswagen, diesel scandal, etc. So the writing is on the wall. The question is, are you going to continue to pretend that the tide is not going out? And then the economic cost that will have to be paid will have to be much, much larger. So at an individual level, if I am, for example, an offshore oil worker in Norway, that's a fair question for me to be asking, hey, but, I'm going to lose my very well-paid job, just because you can have a stupid wind turbine here or something, because Norway will stop drilling oil. But for the Norwegian economy as a whole, there is no trade-off, because all of Norway is going to suffer very, very badly if we don't get ahead of the transition curve, which is happening whether we like it or not. And that point of no return, to my mind, was already creeping closer, but COVID has put the final nail in the coffin of in the coffin of fossil fuels. And any half-responsible political leader, business leader, bureaucrat will have to see the writing on the wall. Otherwise, they will end up paying a much heavier economic, social, and environmental price, 3 or 5 years down the line.
So you mentioned leader. You have political leaders who are the traditional identity of leaders in a political system. However, you have business leaders and you have leaders from other walks of life. Now, my sense is that, at least in the United States, but also around the world, business is more forward-leaning and forward-looking than politicians. Do you agree with that?
At this particular point in time, and on the issue of climate change, I would say yes. And that is maybe not business as a whole, right? But all it takes is people with a public platform. And frankly, okay, so let's maybe put a pause button, right? So there are many more, large multinational and businesses than there are countries, right? So out of that, finding 200 corporate leaders from firms like Unilever, etc., who see the writing on the wall, who see the numbers, the economics of it, and who see the huge potential business benefit they get from the goodwill they get, from the number of customers they're able to retain, and from the fact that green products today enjoy far healthier margins than the normal products do across every single product line.
The UN Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, in my personal view, have made a difference. They have had a much greater impact than the predecessor. They go much broader, deeper, more comprehensively into governance issues, and they change the conversation about future of regulations, and therefore setting a direction for societies, for business and individuals. Do you agree with that? Do you think the SDGs have an impact?
I think the SDGs have had a great anchoring effect. They have anchored the discussion, they've given a common language, they've developed a common framework,
Right.
and increasingly they are being translated and mapped onto business strategies and country goals, etc. That having been said, the rhetoric and the overarching framing of the discussion is one thing, but as a decision tool, they are far less useful. I think there are 179 indicators, right? So I can give you an example. Yeah. So imagine, you are a charlatan. You're a horrible person, but a rich, horrible person, right? So imagine that you set out to leave the world worse than you found it, right? So you're basically an asshole. You want to leave the world worse than you found it. And you spent 5 years trying to do it. At the end of these 5 years, you find a fantastic PR agent who looks through your books, your investments, and they find 5 sustainable development goals that you have positively contributed to, right? You have generated jobs, you have paid taxes somewhere, maybe nowhere close to what you ought to have paid, right? You have maybe, brought access to energy to someone or the other. So the SDGs are so broad that as long as people are allowed to self-report their contributions, everybody can get away with it with SDG credit. And I think here in Norway, isn't it DNB, for example, that focuses on gender inclusion, for example, right? And writes fancy reports about it. At the same time as being one of the largest financiers of oil and gas projects, right? So I don't know which one of these is a far bigger net contribution to the world, but I would say, bringing about gender equality in Norway is a far smaller positive contribution than belching carbon dioxide into the world for the rest of the world to suffer.
Sure. So those in charge, and I now refer mainly to politicians and their supporters, must be slightly more conscious about these pitfalls that you're referring to, and be more ambitious in terms of concretizing what needs to be done. And to quote a famous thinker, what needs to be done in terms of enhancing global governance coherence for the sake of a green transition. How to improve the coherence between existing and or future intergovernmental organizations at the global level. Yeah. And here I'm referring to an observation I made myself when I worked for the UN in discussing the downsides of globalization and the sort of perception of and the reality of injustice in its consequence. The response from the global elite, being political leaders or business leaders, was that needs to be addressed at the national level and at the national level only. My personal view is that is not sufficient. We need to notch up in terms of institutionalizing, reforming global governance institutions in order to ensure better coherence between the green, the blue, and the red corner of sustainable development. And what role do you think Norway can have in this? We can, of course, not dictate other countries' behavior. We're too small for that. Do you think Norway, in its current situation politically, where we, in 2 or 3 months, will take a seat at the new UN Security Council, giving us prominence and visibility, do you think Norway should have the ambition to, if not set the agenda, at least try to influence the agenda on sustainable development within the context of justice for peace?
I think the answer is absolutely yes. And in fact, as you know, we've just launched an institution here, the Nordic Institute for Finance, Technology, Sustainability and Society. And the basic premise is that first of all, the Nordics would benefit enormously from bringing the best global thinking to us, to shake things up, to get us out of our complacence, to elevate our own standards so we can actually be as good as people think we are. Right. And the second part is, particularly in a post-COVID environment, when even in the run-up to COVID, there was an increasing discussion of unsustainable levels of inequality, the need for deeper social contract, etc. But particularly with COVID, I think this is going to be turbocharged. And frankly, and you and I know this, right? While the discussion of the Nordic model has been fashionable and goes up and down in waves, sure, it has never really been seriously discussed at any macro significant institutional level, right? So it's an ILO discussion. Yeah. It's not an IMF discussion.
True, exactly.
And that is what we aim to do. So the idea behind NIFTIS is twofold. We bring the best of global thinking into the Nordics, and we take the best of Nordic thinking, including of the Nordic model, which manages to get these three corners combined quite well into the global macro discussion as part of the post-COVID reform that the world will necessarily need to go through.
That's music in my ears, to be perfectly honest. And now to round up, I think we're approaching our 20 minutes, if not beyond. But I'd like to go back to where we started, to India. Now, Norway and India will join the Council at the same time. Of course, the countries are as different as they can be in many ways. Not in all ways, but in some ways. Now, what could be the potential of collaboration between India and Norway in global governance discussions, and in particular when they join the Security Council at the same time, starting 1st January? Do you think there's a potential for collaboration between this small democracy in the northwest of Europe and the world's largest democracy at the other end of the world?
I think it's huge. And as you know, when you were a Norwegian diplomat in India, and we had these conversations then, I've spent years trying to promote Norwegian-Indian relation. To me, it makes complete sense. Everything from huge investment opportunities for the oil fund, to India being the country after China which is going to determine whether or not we manage to successfully tackle climate change, to the fact that India has not been an aggressive country, has not invaded a single neighbor ever, and remains, the largest democracy in the world, in an otherwise very troubled region surrounded by non-democracies for the most part. The potential for collaboration across the security dimension, across the sustainability dimension, across the dimension of business links, investments, ICT, medicine, what have you, is absolutely enormous. And it's pretty shocking how most of that remains underexploited, and why, and both, to my mind, particularly, from us in Norway, because we are a small country, as you said, why India is not a top priority for the Norwegian, diplomatic service in terms of deepening ties at a personal level, at a business level, at a strategic level. Two immediate things come to mind. One will require, huge changes within Norway. One is, and the other will require huge changes within India. But imagine if India and Norway jointly co-sponsored, a version of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, where Norway agreed that it was going to forego any further drilling and tried to get as much of the world's fossil fuel emitters on board to basically agree to limiting supplies, because that will have to be done if we're going to have any chance. And of course, India, as you know, is going to be the country that is going to be, according to McKinsey at least, most affected by climate change. And according to McKinsey, Indian GDP today is already 35% less than what it would have been had it not been for climate change, likely to get much, much worse. And Norway, as you know, has been, on a per capita basis, one of the largest net contributor. The moral responsibility we carry is huge. So it's a perfect match made in heaven. That combined with Norway persuading India to actually join nuclear non-proliferation, right? So the two biggest threats to humanity, climate change and nuclear war, tackled by an unlikely friendship partnership of David and Goliath. Right. That would be fantastic. A new way of doing diplomacy.
My final question is, continuing on what you just said, I know that many of my friends and colleagues would label you as naive in what you just said. Why are you not naive when you say this?
I have been right on just about everything in the past.
So am I, actually.
I have just been a few years ahead of my time. So I can give you an example. So when I quit investment banking 20 years back, I set up the Tax Justice Network, which is now the world's largest. I was one of the 3 co-founders, and which is now one of the world's largest NGOs fighting tax havens. Aldo came on later as a board member. But and at that time, that was considered to be ridiculous, right? I participated and contributed to multilateral debt cancellation in 2005, which has now become mainstream. And I remember, so I often lecture at the IMF. And I remember that in the early days, I was on the opposite side of the table to the IMF on almost all issues, everything from, capital controls to the importance of inequality, to the need for central bankers to take on climate change, and so on and so forth. And in my last lecture as a visiting scholar at the IMF more recently, I opened with the following line, which was, guys, we agree about everything, and I haven't changed my mind about anything.
You know what? I have a fun remark. You are just as cool and as confident as any top-notch Indian I know, and I know quite a few. Always impressive, always a pleasure. Great talking to you, and I just want to have the last word, okay? When I started my dissertation with "There is no such thing as society," I spent 10,000 words analyzing, proving Thatcher wrong. My final sentence in the same paper was quoting Aristotle, who might be thought of as a greater thinker, frankly. And he said the following: "Only gods and beasts can live outside society, and man is neither." Thank you.